Greetings and welcome. Today we are going to take a look at the final sentences and verses from the first paragraph of chapter 2 of John, which would be verses 11 through, if I can find it, 12. In both the Greek and the Latin, we're going to see how well the Latin holds up to the Greek. In our previous verses, the Latin was actually doing really well. There was a instance in verse 4 where the Greek used an emphatic personal pronoun, but Latin doesn't have any emphatic personal pronouns of the same type as Greek does, so it couldn't do that, which is fine. In verse 5, there could have been a tense issue, but it was hard to tell. Verse 6, I think, also may have had a tense issue. And then verse 7 was where it became seriously separated from the Greek, where we had in the Latin imperfect tenses and in the Greek we had pluperfect tenses. Now, since the imperfect has a variety of different ways that it can be translated, and a variety of different meanings it can have, that, depending on how Jerome intended it to be used in the Latin, might not actually make it an issue. We don't know, so we're going to have to move on. And then the last thing, I think, was in verse 10, where we had an extraneous autem, or some word like that, which didn't take away from the meaning, but it added something that was definitely not there in the Greek. Now, there technically, I suppose, could have been something in a variant of the Greek, but that I don't know. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got here. So we want to make sure that the Latin matches the grammar and the same sense as the Greek as close as it can, according to the way that it works. And here we've got our first, he, the Jesus, our subject right there, aorist tense, did this beginning of signs, direct object, genitive plural. Jesus, subject, did, perfect tense, perfect and aorist, that's good. This beginning of signs, plural and singular, so that's good, they match. In Cana of Galilee, so far so good. Move on. And he revealed or showed, an aorist tense, indicative. And he revealed, showed, or manifested, perfect tense, so that's good. Direct object, glory, his, glory, his. This is the reflexive one, so this is even more clear than the Greek, so that's a good addition. And plural, they believed into him. And plural, perfect tense, they believed into him, good. Disciples as our subject, possessive and possessive. Interestingly, not a reflexive there, but then they, well, I shouldn't say that's interesting. Of course there's not a reflexive there, because these guys are the subject, and this is referring to someone who's not currently the subject, so that's good. Moving on. After this, tuto, we have post hoc after this, so same construction, that's good. Into Capernaum, he himself, I missed the verb, he climbed down or went down, and then we've got he descends or descended. We weren't sure which tense to make this because they both look the same. Since this is aorist tense, perfect is going to be correct there. Cross out the present, circle the perfect. And then we have into implied Capernaum. Then we move on to the next clause and we make sure that everything is still in the screen. Go all the way down here. Looks like we're cutting off some of the Greek. I'll have to shift it around. Anyway, starting with the Greek in this final clause, this is one where I had a bit of an argument with myself whether autos with the first clause or the second clause, and settled on the second because that made most sense because of all the kais. So he himself and his mother and the brothers and his disciples. Where did it go? There it is. He himself and his mother and his brothers and his disciples et. So initially it looks like the Latin has added on an extra eius when there doesn't appear to be one in the Greek for after adelphoi right here, but that is one of the instances where I did go and I checked the variants, and it appears that some variants do have autu, and Nessel Allen, they include it in their text, but I don't think that UBS does for some reason. Anyway, that matches with at least a variant, so that's good. Our final bit, eke, there, third person, aorist, not arrow, remained not for many days, accusative of duration of time. And then in the Latin, and there, third person, plural, perfect, they remained not many days, ablative. So, everything in these two verses, they match up quite well, with one problem, and that's a problem internal to the Latin, and that's ablative right here. If you recall, I couldn't figure out why they would make this ablative. It doesn't make any sense at all, because that's not how you use the ablative, especially when we've got the accusative construction here in the Greek showing duration of time. Ablative can only show us time when, or time within which doesn't make any sense with the sentence right there. Now, admittedly, it could be my mistake right there, and not Jerome's, but to the extent of my knowledge, that's a problem. Maybe there's a variant in the Latin that explains that. So, taking a look at the Latin 11 and 12 to define job, there are only minor issues throughout the rest of it. So I think for this text, I'm going to give it my arbitrary rating of A, because it did a pretty good job. Now, before we go, I learned something interesting within the last few days, listening to some guys who had been over to the region where Kana was, and they talked about this quarry that they were helping excavate. And in this story, earlier on, we're told that the servants pulled out 6 stone water jars. Now, in most picture Bibles or anything like that, these stone jars are always going to be depicted like this. And that is known as an amphora. And amphorae were always made out of pottery. There is not a single instance of a amphora made out of stone that I am aware of, or that these guys were aware of, that has ever been found from antiquity. So this is an incorrect representation of the jars. What they actually had are these massive stone, they almost look like barrels, and they're about half the size of a 50 gallon barrel. I'm going to do a terrible job of drawing them, but they look something like this. And then they'd have designs on the side. They're just massive. Another version of it had basically that same thing. The perspective is dying. And then there was a sort of foot. And it was much fatter than that. But you get the idea. So whenever you go through the story again, you shouldn't think amphora. Completely wrong. It's actually something more like one of these two. There you have it. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope taking a look at this has been helpful for you, and I hope you continue with me as we move on to the next paragraph. And speaking of which, things on my side are getting far more smooshed together. I keep threatening that I might not have videos, and I'm quite serious this time. There should be at least one video next week. No promises beyond that for a while, at least until November. Anyway, have a good day.
Hey, not asleep yet? That's okay. I've got tons of other equally sleep-inducing videos for you to watch. Check them out.